Hello and welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Niall Paterson. Here's our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world. The Charlie Hebdo global fallout. Safety on the streets. Who suffers and who benefits from religious extremism? And walking back to the White House, what are the chances of another President Bush? The French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo was back on sale a week after the brutal strike on its offices. Its cover showed an image of the Prophet Muhammad in defiance of the extremists' action. But what was the point of the attack? The magazine has printed 3 million copies, more than its usual 60,000, and has Islamophobia increased as a result. Let's bring in our guest. In New York, Linda Sasour is the director of the Arab American Association. In your mind, what was the motivation for the killers' attacks?
What I'm saying is that we have to get to the root of the problem. And extremism is now, whether we look at groups like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, where we look at what motivates a young Algerian French man to commit these types of acts. And again, nothing that I'm saying justifies the killing of innocent people, but we really need to put things into context in order for us to address the issue head on. How are we going to address extremism if we don't look at what are some of the things that are causing those? Looking at foreign policy of the West in places like Iraq and in Afghanistan, and looking at what's happening right now with ISIS and in Syria. These are conversations we have to have, and whether or not we want to connect that to what's happening, I think there's a direct link to what's going on. I also think about crime in general, right? Not specifically terrorism. Many people who commit crime or join gangs or are motivated to join these groups of people who commit acts of crime, there's always reasons: marginalization, alienation. It's not usually the prestigious doctor who is living in a villa in the mountains of France who's going out to commit terrorist attacks. Most often these are unemployed, sometimes mentally ill, disturbed. We really need to get to the essence of what's going on. And France hasn't been very friendly to the 4.7 million Muslims, but the story should also be that the majority of the 4.7 million Muslims who live in France are actually peaceful and are not going around committing terrorist attacks. And the story has been branded Islam. It's been branded, this connection to worldwide terrorism. And I think it's inflaming a conversation and potentially Islamophobia. We heard about firebombs at mosques this past couple of days. There were multiple attacks before the attacks in France, in Sweden. We saw thousands of people on the streets in Germany protesting Islam and foreigners. I mean, this is a big pot boiling over in Europe, and we need to figure out how to contain that as soon as possible.
Jeffrey, I mean, does appear to be something of a mixed message, at least from the Muslim community. On the one hand, one can say that these individuals acted because of their faith, because of their religious beliefs. But on the other hand, frankly, anyone who commits an atrocity such as this because they've been offended by a cartoon clearly has something wrong with them.
Oh, quite clearly. I'm afraid that Linda has brought up every tin can cliche she could think of. And while I disagree with most of what she said, she does have a point about some of the things. First of all, France does not get an F for multiculturalism. I lived in France for many, many years, and it is one of the countries in Europe that actually accepts the Muslim population better than others. Let's talk about Germany if you really want to talk about a problem. But no, France is very, very open to that sort of thing. The problem is that most of these young men, and they are men, of course, in the case of the young woman who's now on the lam in Turkey someplace, they are French. And they have been, to some extent, disenfranchised from the system. I agree with you. There are real problems in the banlieue, the suburbs of the big cities. You find it also with different ethnic cultures in Britain, for example. There are real problems in homogenizing, but some of it is because they don't want to homogenize. Some of the immigrant communities do what they can to stay apart. These two young men were French. I'm talking about the two brothers and the third fellow. They were all born in France, and they associated themselves with groups in Algeria and took to the streets and to weapons with a certain type of insanity. Is it to blame Are the French to blame for not incorporating them totally into the system? I'm not so sure that's the answer. They were inflamed by radicals outside of France to react to freedom of the press. And I think France has responded quite well.
It would be easy to dismiss what happened in Paris simply as the acts of a couple of individuals who, frankly, some might argue would be mentally ill. But as Linda was saying there is an extra dimension. There are layers of complexity to this issue that if we are to tackle Islamic fundamentalism at its root cause, we simply can't ignore.
You know, I find what Linda has said to be quite chilling. I find it to be very upsetting, and it's also a part of the problem. You know, it is one thing to have a society in which alcohol is outlawed and violence against strict laws against adultery and all these other things are regularly subjected to public humiliation. But the purity, in my opinion, falls apart when women are raped with impunity and sold into slavery as the spoils of war. Certainly Islam is not the only religion with a vulnerable underbelly of vice and corruption. Actually, far from it. But radical Islamists, which she will never call them radical Islamists, she would never mention that term, seem particularly humorless and impervious to self-reflection in this regard. When ideological purity, Linda, is forced at the point of the sword, this, to me, there is little or no wiggle room for dissent. Any idea that conflicts with the party line is met with instant recrimination. And when the alternatives are obey or die and difference of opinion becomes a de facto of violence, you got to be kidding me? Think about how they treat women in Islam. Look, of course, all Muslims are not that way, but I don't see Christians and anybody else running around the world wreaking havoc with this terrorism.
Linda, do you see the Islam espoused by the two brothers who carried out these attacks as on the same spectrum as the Islam worshipped by those many millions who say, not in our name, we take offence at those cartoons, but we wouldn't carry out an attack in such a fashion?
Again, I mean, if we want to be real analysts, we need to get to the root of the problem. We need to look at the complexities. I don't know if you guys know, but those brothers were aspiring wannabe hip-hop artists. They were drinking. They had girlfriends. They had sex out of marriage. And then we see the other side where you see people in, you know, ISIS showing you prayers and they're praying like 5 times a day and they're devout Muslims. This is not a question. This is not a question to say that there aren't radical Islamists or radical Muslims or there aren't extremists in Islam. I absolutely agree with that. But my point here is you want to talk about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. I'm the first person to protect the right and defend the right of Charlie Hebdo and others to put out and draw whatever cartoon they want. But what I'm saying is, why isn't the story about the Muslim clerk at the kosher market who protected customers who were at the store? Why isn't the story about Ahmed, the police officer, the first victim of these extremists, who's the first one to be shot down? What was he doing? Defending the Charlie Hebdo building. These are not the stories. Then I'm asked to condemn a fringe element of Islam, which you guys agree with, this renegade group of people. But we don't ask Christians to stand up and defend when a Christian goes out and tries to bomb an NAACP building in the United States of America. Thank God nobody was hurt in that situation. Timothy McVeigh was a white Christian. We have a white supremacist who walked in a Sikh temple in Wisconsin here in the U.S. We didn't ask white Christian or white supremacists or the KKK to stand up and denounce the violence by this man. This is the problem that we have, that we continue to focus on this element that Islam and the Muslims have to do this. No, to address extremism, we need to come into this together. You cannot create an us versus them. We need to come together and address the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is not just some renegade Muslims.
Jeffrey.
Wow, us versus them, Linda? Please, please. The fact is, the young Muslim in the kosher butcher shop in Paris was the story. That story got widely reported. The first policeman to die in that attack who was Muslim was the story. That story got widely reported. What I don't see is Islam standing up. Where are the leaders of Islam? The moderate leaders. They marched in Paris. That was great. But where are they in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, condemning this sort of thing? We do condemn Timothy McVeigh. He was sent to trial and executed. We do condemn the bombing at the barbershop, which was next to the NAACP building in Colorado. And it's still being debated whether or not it was a bomb against the NAACP or against the barbershop. The FBI is looking into it. That was a story. No, you're filled with these cliches. There is a case to be answered about the aspirations of young Muslim and young Arabs who were born in France and their ability to rise through the economic cycle. But no, there is no half condemning the atrocities in Paris. That is full condemnation, and I haven't heard that from the Islamic leaders. I haven't heard that from you either.
That's an issue that should be handled there. But still, the issue here is if the Arab world, instead of just giving surface talk, if they really wanted to do something in a very substantive way, they could crush them. Because how do you crush them? You cut off their money supply. You don't give credence, and you don't give credibility, and you don't give a wink when this kind of behavior continues to happen. And having these marches in Paris of 1 million people where these world leaders hold hands, while that symbolism is important, these terrorists are continuing to plan every day, and somebody is aware of what's going on, and somebody has to step up to the plate and say enough is enough. Because it's not these so-called leaders that's going to bring an end to it. It's everyday people who are connected to these networks that finance them through the banks that's going to have to choke them to death to stop this kind of activity. At least it reduce it in a very dramatic way.
Linda, aren't we perhaps beyond the point now of saying that these acts of terror are being committed by a handful of individuals radicalised, coming from the margins of society? I mean, let's list the organisations we've already been discussing: Boko Haram, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. We have, in certain parts of the world, a de facto caliphate already taking place. That doesn't sound to me like the actions of a few marginalised individuals.
Let's look at the numbers. There's 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, the largest and fastest growing religion right now. I think we need to look at the larger story of the Muslim community, where they are, what their contributions to the different societies that they're from. And this idea about condemnation, I mean, the obvious. You condemn always the innocent slaughtering of people. I don't care who they are and where they live and where and in what way that they died. We always need to condemn that. And the question about the half condemnations, unless you, I mean, my friend Reza Islam said something that I think is quite profound. For those that keep talking about the half condemnations of where are the Islamic leaders and the leadership of the Muslim community on the national level, on the international level, Google. I hope that you own Google. Muslims condemn terrorism. Muslims condemn the Paris attacks. I mean, just Google it and tell me how many hits that you will get. That's not always the story. That is not always the media is always looking for the conflict, right? Something that tells a story, and it always includes not putting out the stories of Muslims, putting out condemnations. I want to work on the society that I live in, making sure that everyone's included, that everyone has the same opportunities as everyone else. And I don't think that it's fair to ask for 1.8 billion Muslims to be responsible, right, for the acts of, again, very few. Even if you put all the groups together and you rate. And the ratio to the larger Muslim community of 1.8 billion, it is still like 1.0001% of the people. And again, these groups like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, like Boko Haram, let's be real political and war analysts and think about geographic analysis and what our foreign policy, what happened? How do these groups come up? Do they just wake up one morning? Did Al-Qaeda just wake up one morning and say, we want to now be a terrorist group? There are reasons and elements and factors that we need to talk about that create groups like ISIS, and not just Islamic extremist groups and other extremist groups. What creates these groups? It's not a justification for them being terrorist or extremists. And if it was up to me, we need to eradicate all these groups off the face of the earth. How do we do that? We have to figure out how they started, why they started, and start addressing these root of the problem and stop saying, well, it seems like it's a really big problem right now. It seems like there are more than just a few of them. Okay, great. Let's agree on that. How do we address that problem? And these conversations are not going to the root of the problem, and we're not eradicating ISIS. As a matter of fact, what we do is we fuel organizations. When we have media outlets showing you videos of ISIS beheading innocent people, we're being free publicists. We're giving them the platforms that they're looking for. So I think we need to come together. We need to create some sort of conversation that includes Muslims, and the conversation shouldn't be, what are you doing about it? The conversation should be, what are we doing about it? Whether we be French Muslims, Christians, French, everyone.
Linda, you've become an apologist for this. Let's talk at one country, Yemen. Why has the government of Yemen, supposedly our allies, allowed this group to function? If the government of Yemen really wanted to do something about it, they could eradicate this group in Yemen tomorrow. probably by this afternoon. That's nonsense. These people are being allowed to function and allowed to flourish, not in France, not in the United States, not in Britain, but in the Muslim world. And that's inexcusable.
Why are you calling them your allies? That's the problem with the United States. We're a hypocritical government when we're sitting in the cahoots with countries like Saudi Arabia.
Like you any validity to your argument. No, Linda.
We need to get to the root of the problem, and you're not getting to the root of the problem.
Shame on you. Shame on you, Linda. You're an apologist for these people, and it's utter nonsense. You cannot do that. Sorry.
I'm afraid this is frankly a debate we could carry on for days, but I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Linda Sasour, thanks very much for your time. Jeffrey Armstrong, back with you in a moment. So, just who is going to be fighting next year's presidential election? Yes, I'm afraid we're already talking about it. Could we see another Bush-Clinton campaign? John Ellis Bush, we know him as Jeb Bush, is gearing up and raising funds. Well, Dr. Philippa Malmgren is a former advisor to President Bush. So I suppose I don't really need to guess who you'll be voting for come the election.
Well, I haven't said publicly who I'm voting for, and that's partly because we have no idea who the candidates are going to be yet. It's so early on in the process. And even on the Democrat side, it's by no means obvious that Hillary Clinton will be the nominee for sure. And on the Republican side, everyone thinks it's a no-brainer that Jeb Bush will be it. But within the Republican Party, I think there's still some resistance to this idea. So, a lot can happen in politics in a very short period of time. So I don't even know who I'm voting for yet. But yes, you're right. I'm likely to vote for the candidate who's a Republican.
Might I just gently suggest that when it comes to the Republican nomination, there might be two names to consider. Jeb Bush and a name that will also be pretty familiar to our viewers, Mitt Romney.
Yeah, I mean, clearly Mitt Romney is playing around with the idea of coming into the race. What's interesting is that none of these candidates on the Republican side are coming in with a kind of on the front foot approach. Even Jeb Bush suffers from a slight sense of a reluctant candidate. And Mitt Romney suffers from a slight sense of, I should have had it last time, maybe there's a chance this time. And I personally would like to see candidates come forward with a stronger sense of conviction. But again, it's early days, so you kind of can't blame them for putting a toe in the water. And frankly, what I'm advising here is hurting Hillary Clinton, who comes in with an attitude of imperiousness of kind of, hey, it's mine, which I think is turning voters off even on her own team.
Armstrong, it is potentially a fascinating battle for the Republican nomination. I'm salivating at the prospect of a Romney-Bush clash. I mean, as Philippa was just saying there, I mean, Romney does have the form. Bush perhaps has the bigger name.
Well, I don't want to rain on your parade, but most of the media is so in love with these establishment candidates. And of course, that is what you like to see. But listen, there's within the Republican Party and even the establishment and even people who give substantial dollars, they're really snarling at the fact that Mitt Romney, who had the nomination and lost, would even be considered and run again. The Republican Party actually operates like a hierarchy. He's had his time has passed. I think many people will be shocked if Mitt Romney decides to run, because if he does decide to run as an establishment candidate, it's going to do more than harm Jeb Bush and Chris Christie, and also they take away from that money pool. And I think within their camps, they're going to do everything they can to stop him in his tracks.
Jeffrey, I mean, what do you think is the likelihood that by the time we get to the point at which they are officially seeking the nomination and they're not just dipping toes into the water, we would see both Romney and Bush going for it? I mean, as everyone's basically been saying thus far, there is a finite amount of money in the world, although let's not forget that Mitt Romney has plenty of his own.
Well, there was a man in American politics for a long time named Harold Stassen, who had been the governor, I think, of Minnesota. He ran for president 10 times. Mitt Romney is becoming the Harold Stassen joke of the 21st century. Mitt Romney doesn't stand a chance. He was rejected by his own party 6 years ago. He was roundly rejected by the country 2 years ago. He will not go through the course. Jeb Bush, another story. Jeb is trying to deny history, deny his record, deny his political stance, move towards the middle to become more acceptable. But that means risking the loss in the primaries. The right wing of the Republican Party would never go for him, and the country's fed up with Bushes. Who does that leave? Chris Christie, who's completely unelectable, couldn't even get reelected in New Jersey if he ran again. Scott Walker from Ohio, who may be in with a shot, but they tried to impeach him. George Pataki's on the list, former governor of New York, a forgotten man. And then you've got the clown car brigade. You've got Rick Santorum and Mike Huckabee, Rick Perry, Ted Cruz. Boy, that would be great. I mean, I would actually send money to the Ted Cruz campaign, because then Hillary would win 70 states and there are only 50. John McCain is trying to push Lindsey Graham, another great idea for the Democrats. Rand Paul's trying to move to the middle too. And my bet is if there's an outside candidate, Rand Paul will be it. So Hillary will only win 60 states. The New York Times says there's a possibility of 26 candidates right now who are dipping their toes into the water. The Republicans, be careful what you wish for, guys, have won both houses of Congress, and they will proceed to do what the Republicans always do, screw that up. So that by the time we get to the primaries in the summer of 2016, whether or not Donald Trump is part of the group, they will self-destruct. So all I have to say is go Mitt, go Ted Cruz. Can't wait for it.
Philippa, I have to give you the opportunity to respond to Jeffrey there on, given your association with the Klan. Is America sick of the Bushes?
You know, I don't think it as sick of it as the media would like to think so. And I think that Jeb Bush will prove to be, he's more conservative than people give him credit for. And I don't think he'll have as hard a time with the far right as people say. But the real issue is globally, we are seeing general public saying, I'm tired of the old gang. I want somebody new who can fix problems. And therefore, there's got to be a premium on all these candidates that nobody talks about and hasn't really heard of. I think the outsider odds are very high in this particular election. And let's not forget, the last few presidents were similar. I mean, Bill Clinton came out of nowhere and basically won because all the establishment figures on the Democrat side said this race is too hard to win, and they dropped out. It was like the water boy on the baseball team said, let me have a go. President Obama arguably came out of nowhere. And I don't see why we can't get another candidate like that. And if anything, I think Jeb Bush is going to define what the issues are at one end of the spectrum. And I think Ted Cruz is going to have a voice in this and will define the issues at the other end. And the candidate that probably comes forward the strongest will be a third person who establishes what's the right place to be between those two guys.
Armstrong, I mean, given we've had 2 terms of Obama, I mean, do you see the Republicans, possibly because of that Cruz effect, whoever the candidate is, do you see them being pushed further to the right than perhaps ever before?
I think it's obvious by the coup they tried to pull to make sure that Boehner did not win the speakership on the first ballot, that obviously Boehner and Mitch McConnell has more respect within their party because they see them as consensus builders, and they work very close. They work very well with the president, even though they don't get enough credit for it. And look, you say whatever you want to say about Jeb Bush, but look, I know people are probably saying we don't want a monarchy here, but the bottom line, Americans are really desperate for leadership on the foreign front. They're desperate for it on the domestic front. And if Jeb Bush has the right ideas and the right leadership, and he can sort of get his issues together on immigration and Common Core and shoulder his base with conservatives, look, you cannot count him out. I think the fact that he is a Bush, no one's going to question his ability to lead and his ideas. I don't think you can count anyone out. I think, though, that this is an opportunity for a dark horse to rise. I think the Republicans have learned from the past when they did not have the power and they were out in that valley. And I think they will come together and they will not do what Jeffrey's trying to indicate. They will show leadership. They will work with the president. They will get things done for the American people. And I think if they do this, if they deliver through substance and not through rhetoric, I think it gives the Republicans a great chance to do something that rarely happens in history, where they control all 3 chambers, the White House and Congress.
Jeffrey,
well,
briefly,
the height of Armstrong.
Armstrong,
the height of their leadership was Mitch McConnell coming into office saying, "My job is to make sure this is a one-term president." That's real leadership.
As for Jeb Bush, history. You keep going back to that. That's ancient history.
Ancient history.
Give us something new. We're beyond that. Give us something new. We've heard that before, please.
Come on, give us a break.
And it's real. It's Mitch McConnell.
What has he
That's the
said
kind of
since becoming
Republican
majority
feeling.
leader? What has he said since becoming majority leader? You can't even tell us because you're so
Hey,
stuck in
guys.
the past.
Please,
I have a question.
He's going to push through. He's going to push through all the social legislation that none of America wants. Let's talk about Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush and his leadership. Jeb Bush could not even win Florida in a presidential election. That's what they think of his leadership down there. I think you're right that the dark horse has a real shot at this. But he's going to have to come up pretty soon and make himself known, because the main candidates, Christie and Walker and Bush and Romney, are absolutely going to self-destruct. There is no doubt about that. So a dark horse, yeah, sure, maybe.
But here's my question, is why is it that all the polls show the American public wants bipartisanship, and yet it seems to be the one thing that neither side can deliver? And the question is there a place for a candidate who really supports bipartisanship, or does that kill them in their effort to win?
Got to leave it there. Dr. Philippa Malmgren and Jeffrey Robinson and Armstrong Williams, as always, thanks very much for your time. Well, that is your lot for this edition of The Debate. Until next time, goodbye.